Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Leek.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Erika Leek.
And I'm Dr. Tonya Breland. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of our podcast.
This is Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And in this podcast series, we discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just and free. And the goal here is to disrupt the status quo. So all of the things that we talk about are really an attempt to really challenge ourselves to disrupt the status quo in a number of areas that we discuss. And it's the status quo of racial inequality and inequity. Mm-hmm. So each episode, we challenge ourselves to be the change we want to see. Mm-hmm. So what's our topic for today?
Is privilege an honor? Is privilege not an honor?
Yes.
Yes.
How about that?
Where does that come from?
So we always hear about, somebody says, it's a privilege and an honor.
Yes.
Right? So
right.
We always use that phrase. So today we want to wonder, okay, so and privilege and honor are seen as synonymous.
Right.
But in this case, is privilege synonymous with honor?
Is it?
Is it?
That's a good question.
I think so.
What do you think?
So talk a little bit about what do we mean by privilege?
We've talked about privilege before,
mm-hmm.
so we would love for you to go back and check that one out as well. But today we're going to go in a direction that's slightly different. Privilege is big. When we think about privilege, we're often talking about those unearned rights that people may have, mm-hmm. Or entitlements that they may have, typically not something that they've earned, except usually in the case of education, where
mm-hmm.
that can be earned. We hold certain things in our society that we hold as
mm-hmm.
as being privileged. When we look at certain groups of people who have certain characteristics. Our society says these people, are privileged. Mm-hmm. And when we hold certain privileges, mind you, we all have certain privileges. Mm-hmm. When we hold certain privileges, it's easy for us to be oblivious to the things that, or to those areas where people don't have privilege, because we just kind of go along, and just almost make assumptions mm-hmm. about groups of people. And that's kind of like the long version of privilege. I don't know if you have like a quicker, shorter, more abridged version.
I do not.
Yeah.
I think that was very succinctly and I would say accurately put. You talked about the physical traits of privilege. And so, there's a reason why. I think it's like almost, most of our U.S. presidents have been over 6 feet. Mm-hmm. Like there's a reason, right? So there's a privilege in height. Yeah. And a certain height.
And we've talked about that before.
And we have talked about that in a previous episode. So, so that means that the privilege, and it's not that these tall people didn't work.
Right.
Right? We're not saying that they didn't work for what they, achieved. We're not saying that, but there is a reason, like in terms of the height, you get the benefit of the doubt in mm-hmm. some areas, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So there's just certain things that you don't necessarily have to prove to people or to a group. Like you don't have to prove, you get the benefit of the doubt mm-hmm. for having these leadership qualities mm-hmm. because of your height. Mm-hmm. Right? That's privilege.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I am one of those people that tend to benefit from mm-hmm. the height privilege mm-hmm. Because I'm nearly 5'7", mm-hmm. and for a woman that's on the taller side. And if I put on heels, I can be 5'10", 5'11", depending on the heels that I wear. Okay. I'm not bragging, but I do know that I don't have to think about
That's right.
my height.
Right. And I do.
Except when the pants aren't long enough, you know, and then I'm annoyed, you know, like, how dare they not have pants that fit my size, you know.
On the other hand,
right.
I am under 5'4". I'm 5'4". And so I have to really think about when I want to buy a pair of slacks, right? So I usually have to get them. I mean, I can buy them so that they fit, but I have to usually have to get them tailored,
right?
For the right, you know, make sure that they're right length. When I go to the grocery store, I talk about this a lot in trainings.
Yeah.
But when I go to the grocery store, I have to think twice because I may not be able to reach something, you know. So I talk a lot about like the wine. So I can't get the top shelf stuff because I can't reach the top shelf.
I know.
So it's, you know, Sutter Home wine for me, you know, which I like Sutter Home. I love Sutter Home. I really do. And I get it because that's what I could reach,
right,
you know.
Right.
But in terms of the height, like I have to think about it.
Right.
Like that's something that I have to really take into consideration. Like when I go somewhere, am I going to be able to reach it?
And I have to make myself think about it because I know that it's something that I can easily take for granted.
Yeah.
Because typically it's not a challenge for me.
You know what's something I always have a challenge with? I don't know why, but in my local supermarket, Goya rice, the family pack of the yellow rice, first of all, it's always on the top shelf, and it's never like towards the front. So if it's towards the front, I can tip it over.
On the thing.
I can tip it into my so I have to stand, and that's dangerous.
Yes,
you know, and it's always in the back. I just want to say that, you know, if you stock Goya rice, you know, try to put it in the front for people like us.
And a lower shelf.
And on a lower shelf. On a lower shelf, that would be great because it's a really popular item.
It is.
So why would it be up at the top in the back? I don't know, but anyway.
I don't know, you know, but we talk a lot about, you know, I mean, our whole podcast is centered around, you know, racial inequality and racial inequities and systems.
Yes.
And so, you know, obviously we're going to talk about racial inequality as it relates to privilege because that is a part of the topic.
It is.
Here and a part of our theme with all of our podcasts. And, you know, we're not just, you know, shooting from the hips here. There are, you know, documented, well-documented, you know, information, if you will. There is well-documented information in books and articles and what have you that really speak to privilege and white privilege, which we know is like a buzzword, a triggering word that can anger people and that can immediately shut people down. But don't shut down. We don't want you to shut down. We want you to engage in a conversation with us about this because there's some information that maybe you may have taken for granted, much like I take for granted my height and the privilege of my height. You may have taken some things for granted being white versus what we may experience being black.
That's right.
And so I pulled this from a book by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility. Now it's a book that I don't usually recommend it as like the first book that someone reads when they're addressing racial inequality and racial issues. However, I do think it should be on the list of books that people should read because it really is enlightening in many ways. And so she talks about the racial breakdown of people who control institutions. Now this data is as of 2016-17. So it's really interesting. The 10 richest Americans, 100% white. 100%.
Wow.
7 of whom are among the 10 richest in the world. So this is in 2016-17. We realize it's 2023.
But it's not that long ago.
Right. And this has not changed drastically, if at all.
If at all, right.
U.S. Congress, 90% white. Now, I do think there may be a few changes there, possibly. I think there may be a little bit more, but probably not drastically. Right. But we encourage you to look that up. You know, we're not stating that there could not have been some progress. U.S. governors,
96% white.
Yep.
Again, this was in 2016, but I don't think it's changed that much.
No.
Yeah.
Top military advisors,
100% white.
I recently heard on the news that they were honoring, that they were getting ready to honor the first Black 4-star general in, I don't know if it was the Army, I believe it was the Army, the first in our history in this country.
Wow. Okay.
So this one we know is not
Right.
completely accurate, president and vice president, because we've had President Barack Obama and Vice President Kamala Harris.
So what does that mean? 99%?
Probably.
I guess, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
The U.S. House Freedom Caucus.
99% white.
The current U.S. presidential cabinet, so these are decision makers we're talking about as of 2016-17, 91% white.
And I do think that's a little lower now, but I'm not totally sure.
People who decide which TV shows that we see, 93% white. People who decide which books we should read. So these are the people who are over the publishing companies.
90% white.
People who decide which news is covered.
85% white. And whoever that is, they love the royal family.
They do. Absolutely.
Like a lot.
People who decide which music is produced. So we're talking about major record labels, what have you.
95% white.
People who directed the 100 top grossing films of all time worldwide.
95% white.
Teachers.
82% white.
That still holds.
Yes.
Full-time college professors.
84% white.
Owners of men's professional football teams.
97% white.
Wow. What does that tell you?
Yeah, we have a long way to go, and that privilege is real, right? That privilege is real. So the idea that, you know, marginalization or racism or, you know, that we've all worked it out. This is the post-racial era or whatever.
I'm sorry.
It's just not true.
It's not.
It's just not
not.
true.
It's not funny, but I'm laughing because it's like, ha!
Yeah.
You know, as you're talking about post-racial era, it's not.
It's not true.
No.
Yeah.
And you know, as I look at these numbers and I think about it, I can't help but think about the lens.
Yeah.
Okay? So, you know, the lens that people have. So when it comes to, you know, the decisions that are made in our country, the decisions that are made in government, the decisions that are made in entertainment, the decisions that are made in the news, education, you know, from K through college and beyond.
Yeah.
So we know, having terminal degrees, I believe it's less than 2%.
Less than 2%
of people have terminal degrees. Those are like, you know, people with doctorates. I have one. Erika will have one shortly. And we know that we are privileged in the education department, and that is one of the privileged areas where we earn that privilege.
That's right.
But we know that the narrative in most, you know, organizations, or the lens in most organizations, are very white-centric.
Very much so.
And even if you say, well, we have some diversity, we can tell you that the just based upon these figures here, that the diversity that is held is likely not enough. There are likely not enough voices of color on any of these organizations and leading these organizations. And these are for like major organizations, not minor organizations. We're talking about major organizations where we see this happening.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these are like major domains in our in terms of our lives, right? So, and they really do govern. They determine what our lifestyle will be, right? And so, you know, the fact that, you know, you have such a lack of diversity, I mean, it starts to make sense when you think about, you know, how certain groups are not considered in a domain like the arts, like entertainment, you know. So If you want to watch, I'll just speak for myself. There are times when I may want to watch something like a show or something on TV that represents a different group.
Mm-hmm.
I have to search for it.
Mm-hmm.
I got to really look for it. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not just, it doesn't just pop up. Netflix now has like all algorithms, and sometimes it'll pop up, but you really got to look for those things if you want to, find something that represents a different culture outside of like, white, middle class values. Like you got to find, or white middle class people.
Right.
You got to find it.
Right.
You really got to search for
Right.
it. But that's because who determines what's on television, are, mostly white.
Right.
When we think about education and we think about like, there's a real challenge diversifying the curriculum so that there's accurate representation.
Right.
There's a challenge there. But
because those who are in charge of the curriculum, of developing the curriculum,
that's right,
tend to be white.
That's right. And it's not enough to say, well, we have a black vice president, right? It's not enough, right? So then in the system, who are the voices in the system that get to determine the extent to which, something is, played or presented or taught or whatever, and it's predominantly white.
Right.
And so when we talk about privilege, it's not just sort of one person getting ahead. This is a system. This is an entire system. And so that privilege kind of makes it so that you don't even, like you said, I don't even think about it, right? Like in terms of the height, like I don't even think about it when I go to the store, when I go to, purchase slacks or whatever. I don't even think about it. But those who are, when we think about, white privilege, as a white person in this country, you don't have to think about it.
Right.
Right?
You may think about it.
You can.
You're
right.
probably the ones watching this podcast.
Yes.
You're probably the ones thinking about it.
Right. Right.
But we know that it may not be the majority
That's right.
of people thinking
That's
about
right.
it because they don't really have to. I don't
That's right.
have to think about it. I have to really like train myself to think about, here's where I have privilege and you might not.
That's right.
I have to really be very intentional about that.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, like there was an article, maybe you can talk a little bit more about it, that was just, to kind of help you really get another picture, using another type of example of what privilege looks like.
Yeah.
Let's look at our transportation system.
Yeah. So there was a great article about privilege, and the analogy that was used was the transportation system. And so if we look at the transportation system, look at the roads. The roads are built for cars, right? But if I'm a cyclist, if I'm on a bike, then I have the right to ride my bike in the street, but the streets are built for cars and trucks, right? So the writer was saying that when she's on her bike, she gets yelled at, move out of the way, and she gets made to feel that she's in the way, right? Because all of the, everything in terms of, the size of the roads and all of that, it's really built for cars. Sometimes there might be a bike lane, but very often there isn't, right? If you notice when somebody's on a bike, they have like hand signals to turn. But how many people in a car actually know those hand signals, right? And so when we think about the safety of the person on the bike, very often, if this person is giving you a signal that they're turning, if everybody else doesn't know those signals, right? Like that person could be in some real danger, And so the article, which is a really great article, was really sort of taking a look at privilege. She's used that transportation metaphor or that analogy to really sort of like exemplify and explain what privilege looks like. And I thought it was really brilliant.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. There's one country, I mean, there are probably other countries, but there's one country that I visited, Belgium, and in particular, Ghent. And they actually are very bike friendly. So, you know how we have parking lots or garages for cars? They have garages for bikes. And I've never seen anything like it. Like the bikes are everywhere. Like it is more the norm to ride the bike there than it is to travel in vehicles.
That's a good point. Like here, even if you rode your bike, where would you put it once you got to
Right.
wherever you're going.
There's nowhere for us to park our bikes if we want to use our bike as the main mode of transportation. There are very few.
It's really good point.
Very few places for us to park. But if you are, if you're a motorist, in the car, you don't have to think about that.
Right.
You don't have to think about that. You've got the privilege of the car because the road was made for you.
That's right. And wherever you get to where you're going to have a place to park.
Absolutely.
It may be frustrating to find it.
Right.
Right. It may cost you, but you're going to have a place to park your car. Yeah.
Right. Right. Because it was made that way.
Yes.
The system was set up that way.
That's right.
And I think that's what we have to understand about this country. Yeah. The system was set up to privilege white people over Black people or other people of color. That's how the system was set up. Earlier in another podcast, we talked about, race being a construct. And of course, that construct was not for any positive purpose. And so, the same thing with privilege. Privilege was, it's built into the fabric of our society.
So everything. I think about hair care, right?
Yep.
So when you go somewhere, there's literally they used to call it black hair. Now it's ethnic hair, but it's you get you get almost like a column, but everything else is geared towards, European, white, women and men, right? And so this idea that, okay, you get this section, but everything else, that's privilege. So when you go to Walgreens or when you go to, wherever you go to get your hair care products, as a white person, there's no thought that there wouldn't be something here for you.
Right.
Right. And that's just not the case for non-white, individuals.
I was recently looking for a dry shampoo for my mom who's ill and can't go to a hairdresser. And I'm in the store and I'm up and down the aisles, and I see dry shampoo, but they're not in the section where the Black hair care products are. And, I made the mistake, in the past of purchasing one from the white side, which was the larger, all the shelves primarily, except this small section were, hair care products that were geared towards white women. And I made a mistake before purchasing something that on the can looked like it was good, and it actually was not good. And so I was looking, I'm like, there's got to be something here. I didn't find anything that I could use for her hair. And, I was kind of disappointed because I wanted to be able to do that for her. But that's a really good point that you bring up, that, just products. And Peggy McIntosh, wrote about that very thing in the 80s, the 1980s. She wrote about that, and it's not that different today.
It's not.
She said, she talked about, she wrote a piece, for those of you who've not been familiar with it, called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And so she starts the article off talking about male privilege. So she's a white woman. She's talking about, her experiences with male privilege. And she makes this statement, and I'm just going to read it directly from her piece. I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. And that was really interesting to me. And it's 1989 when this was published. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, how appropriate even this is today in 2023. We're talking many, many years ago when I was a college student, pre-marriage, pre-children, pre-grandchild in my case.
I think that's, the title Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, I think is so apt because just like you said, people in privilege are taught not to really even see the privilege. And I think that's why, in a previous episode, we talked about the backlash.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the challenge. I think people don't really want to see that privilege. There's a few examples that she provides that, that sort of lend itself to her privilege. She says that one of the things she says is, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I want to live.
That's correct.
That's privilege.
That's privilege.
That's privilege, right?
Yeah.
There's another one that
when you purchased your home, we'll go back to that in a minute, but when you purchased your home, what were the considerations that you had?
That's a good question. So one of the huge considerations was that we could not be the only African Americans on the block. We could absolutely not be the only African Americans on the block. So we looked at the communities, we looked at the demographics, we looked at the racial makeup, and then when we actually went, searching, particularly when we saw the house that we wanted, we drove around the neighborhood. It was like, okay, so who lives here? Because the demographics in the town are one thing, but who lives where in a town is another.
That's correct.
Right? So yeah, that was one of them. And the school system,
My husband and I, when we first got married, made the mistake of moving into an area. We didn't stay there very long. Moving into an area in an urban city in New Jersey. We moved into a city and we're thinking, well, it's a city, you can move wherever. And we ended up moving into the part of the city where there were very few Black people. But we had no idea because we didn't do our due diligence.
You have kids yet?
We didn't have kids.
Okay.
It's when we first got married. And we noticed we were called the N-word multiple times. We would walk, we didn't have a car yet, so we would walk to the grocery store and mothers would pull their children like this away from us when we were walking down the street. I kid you not.
No,
this was our experience, and so we moved. At some point we moved. We're like, clearly we're not welcome here. And that's sad. That's the case. But Peggy McIntosh is right. We have to think. Right. We have to think about where we go.
You gotta think twice. You have to think twice.
Yeah. There was a quote that she gave also that I thought was really, really key, and that quote was, the pressure to avoid having conversations or to avoid acknowledging privilege. The pressure to avoid it is great, for in facing it, I must give up the myth of meritocracy, which is a narrative that we talked about in a previous podcast.
That's huge. That's huge. So that there are certain things, if you have privilege, you don't have to work for. You get the benefit of the doubt. That's really what it is. You get the benefit of the doubt. You are assumed to be competent, and you are assumed to, know what you're doing, and that's an assumption. And other groups have to prove it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of like what we think about all the time. I mean, we go to restaurants. The first thing I do when I walk into a restaurant, are there other people here that look like me?
Yeah.
And is it safe for me to be in here?
That's right. If you've never read White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, we invite you to do so. You can Google it. It's by Peggy McIntosh. It's a really great piece.
It is.
We invite you to do that. And we're so happy that you joined our conversation today.
There's still more to talk about with this topic.
There's a whole lot more to talk about.
Because it's big.
Yeah.
It's big.
Yeah.
But, we wonder, what are those things that you take for granted that you don't have to think about, that you can be oblivious to? Because if there are things that you can identify, then you know that you have privilege. And again, I must reiterate, we all have privilege of some sort.
We do.
We talked about, privilege here that we have and that we hold. But think about where you might have privilege and somebody else might not. And how can you even lend your privilege to others to create a better either better access or better opportunities for other people?
Right.
So again, as Erika said, we thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear your comments and your feedback and your experiences. Please share them with us on any of our social media pages, and we look forward to hearing from you. Again, I'm Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika. Thank you so much for joining us today.